Today we have another Hometown Historian channel production. Enjoy.
So the question we have is, who was John Augustus Sutter? He's a man much more than the simple beginnings that he came from, and he's much more than what is generally known. So let's go into it a little bit more. Johann Augustus Sutter, he was born on February 23rd, 1803, in Kandern, Baden, which is present-day Germany. He was born to Johann Jacob Sutter, who's a foreman at a paper mill, and Christina Wilhelmine Sutter. His father came from a nearby town of Runeberg in the canton of Basel in Switzerland. So he is of Swiss descent, though he came from Germany. And his maternal grandfather was actually a pastor from Grenzach on the Swiss-German border. He eventually wound out coming over here to the United States, or over to which was the new American country, and he was a Swiss immigrant, and he was of both Mexican and American citizenship. He was known for establishing Sutter's Fort near Sacramento, California, which he also founded. And he became famous following the discovery of gold by his employee James W. Marshall and the mill-making team at Sutter's Mill. Sutter saw his own business ventures fail during the California gold rush, even though those of his elder son, John Augustus Sutter Jr., were more successful. He is a man of interesting eccentricities, if you will. And as we talk about him more and more here and go into his life, delve into his life much deeper, you'll notice certain things about him that he had certain behavioral tendencies throughout his life. So this wasn't one of those things. With any historical figure, I like to give him benefit of the doubt, and I'd like there to be a lot of information, in fact, to back up whatever claims are made about them, because a lot of times history can be rather unfair. There can be, especially in present day, we'll see that from time to time, that there's certain things that are said about individuals from history, and there really isn't a whole lot of factual basis. Sometimes it's based upon just assumption or presumption, or sort of lumping them in with a generalized group. With General Sutter here, there's a lot of fact, a lot of statements that they made about some of the behaviors that he had, especially once you go over to his time in what would become Sacramento at Sutter's Mill and Sutter's Fort. He did a lot of things there that we have to give him credit for, but it's not good things to have credit for. He has done a lot of things as well, paving the way for settlers to come into California. He can get credit for that as well. The stuff that happened with Sutter's Mill and having basically everything that he had built there ruined, that can be taken credit for as well. He was a man, if I would make a summary, he is a man that over and over again was given opportunity after opportunity after opportunity, and not just a regular opportunity, but extraordinary opportunities, as we'll talk about, and really didn't make the best of them. maybe for a while, but eventually, because of his demons, because of his eccentricities, because of his ways, his behavioral tendencies that we talk about, he really, in the end, was his own worst enemy and was the enemy to civilization in a lot of ways as well. And, we talk about life with karma, and karma in a lot of ways caught up to him with what happened at Sutter's Mill. And so let's talk more about this man, John Augustus Sutter, who he was, where he came from, the whens, wheres, and hows, and all that. So let's first talk about his time in Europe. This is a picture of his home that he was born at in Kandern, which would have been present-day Germany, as we discussed. He actually attended school there in Kandern. He studied at St. Blaise. Blase is probably how it's pronounced, because it'd be that combination of Swiss French, between 1818 and 1819, and then worked as an apprentice at the Thermesen printing and publishing house in Basel until 1823. Between 1823 and 1828, he worked as a clerk at clothing shops in Aarberg and Burgerdorf. At age 21, he married, and he was the daughter of a rich widow. He operated a store but showed more interest in spending money than in earning it. I ask you to take note of that, because this is something that throughout his life was one of the causes of his problems, because like I said, as we'll see throughout the video, he was giving one extraordinary opportunity after another, and one of his biggest failings in business was that he liked to spend the money. He didn't necessarily enjoy the earning of it. And because of this problem of family circumstances and mounting debts, Johann faced charges that would have placed him in jail, because they had back then, it was like debtor's prison. So he decided to dodge trial and fled to America. And at that point, and this is another one of those things that take note of, he styled his name as Captain John Augustus Sutter. And one of the things he would do is he would say he was a captain of the Swiss Guard. So he was very good at promoting himself. He's very good at manipulating. And this is one of those things that he got himself into the right circles because he seemed like he belonged. He also was able to throw out a history that wasn't necessarily true and get him in places where he probably did not belong. So in May of 1834, he left his wife and 5 children behind in Bergdorf, Switzerland, with a French passport. He boarded the ship Sully, which traveled from France to New York City, where it arrived on July 14th, 1834. And let's continue talking about his trip to the New World. So it's a little bit of understanding we have of him. He was very self-promoting. He was very smart. He really was. He just was not good with money. He started to style himself, he called himself captain, but he would style himself Johann Augustus Sutter. He would, for the rest of his life, he would call himself John Augustus Sutter, because he felt like it gave him a little bit of a flair, a little bit of a European nobility type sound. And so he went with that. And he was smart. I have to give him credit. Preparation. He learned Spanish and English in addition to Swiss French. After they had arrived in New York City, he got together with 35 other Germans, and they moved to the St. Louis region. And then they have eventually continued together to Santa Fe, New Mexico, which at that time was then still a province of Mexico. Then they moved to a town of Westport, now the site of Kansas City. And on April 1st, 1838, he joined a group of missionaries led by the fur trapper Andrew Drips, and traveled the Oregon Trail to Fort Vancouver in Oregon Territory, which they reached in October. He had originally planned to cross those mountains during winter, but the acting chief, James Douglas, convinced him that such an attempt would be perilous. So ultimately, Douglas charged Sutter 21 pounds to arrange transportation on the British ship Columbia for himself and his 8 followers. The Columbia then departed Fort Vancouver on November 11th and sailed to the Kingdom of Hawaii. And remember, at this time, it was another one of those things. Hawaii was far yet from being a state, and they were a kingdom at that point. They reached Honolulu on December 9th. Sutter had missed the only ship outbound for Alta, California, and had to remain in the kingdom for 4 months, which in a way wound up being rather advantageous. He, like I said, he was a bit of a schmoozer. He was good at, presenting himself, and he was a captain of the Swiss Guard, so he got a chance to meet with the consuls of the United States of America, United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland, John Coffin Jones and Richard Charlton, along with merchants such as the American Faxon Atherton. The brig Clementine was eventually hired by Sutter to take freight provisions and general merchandise for New Archangel, now known as Sitka, the capital of the Russian-American Company colonies in Russian America, which I'm assuming that is Alaska, because Russia did own Alaska until we bought Alaska, I think, during time of the Civil War. It was Sutter, I believe, Secretary of State, who encouraged Abraham Lincoln to buy the Alaskan territory, and it was a great deal. But anyways, so he had sort of looked around with talking to different people, found where would possibly be a great way to set up business, and this seemed like a great deal. So he wound out joining the crew. Him and 10 native Hawaiian laborers and several other followers embarked on April 20th, 1839, and they stayed at this New Archangel for a month. He joined several of the balls hosted by Governor Kuperanoff, and once again, this is probably the Alaska Territory, who likely gave him help in determining the course of the Sacramento River. The Clementine then sailed for Alta, California, arriving on July 1st, 1839 at Yerba Buena, which is now San Francisco, which at the time was the only small seaport town. So you'll see how part of it smarts, no doubt, but he was able to present himself as something he wasn't, and something that was attractive to people. So he was very, very intelligent at putting himself into these positions and building up his time there in the New World to place himself where he would be in a position to actually do what comes next, which is involving Sutter's Mill and Sutter's Fort. So in this fourth part, we're going to go into the Fort Sutter, Sutter's Mill, and then obviously what happened with the gold rush happening and him losing everything, eventually winding out in Lidditz, Pennsylvania for the last 9 years of his life. We're not going to go into the controversial nature of him till this companion piece, which will wind up coming out tomorrow, which we're actually going to go in depth into how he actually attained this success. So at the time of his arrival in Alta, California, it was a province of Mexico and had a population of Native Americans established at between 100,000 to 700,000. They just generally don't know. And one of the things you had to do to occupy that territory, to settle, and part of this was because of what happened in Texas. Obviously, something that, we'll talk about here, the Texas Revolution. Mexico opened up the Texas territory. They thought it'd be good to have settlers in there and building up the territory, making it have value. They just didn't expect that the settlers, there'd be that many that would decide, we want to make this our own territory, because there was a voracity for new land, and Americans really did enjoy whenever an opportunity came upon them to say, hey, here's some new land, and they ran at it. They were very much hardworking, opportunists. If the opportunity arose, they took it, and Texas was a new territory, a big territory, and it sort of overwhelmed the Mexican authorities. So they did not want that same thing to happen in their other territories, especially California, because California was a land that was ripe with natural resources. It was beautiful land. The lands in New Mexico and Arizona and what would eventually become Nevada and Utah, they were also beautiful lands, but they didn't hold the promise quite like California and Texas did. So they had changed the way that they allowed things to happen. So if you wanted to settle in that Mexican territory, California, you had to go to the government of Mexico and request permission. So he had to go to the capital at Monterrey to obtain permission from the governor, Juan Bautista Alvarado, to settle in that territory. And Alvarado actually saw Sutter's plan of establishing a colony in Central Valley as useful in buttressing the frontier for which he was trying to maintain against Indians, Russians, Americans, and British. Sutter, once again, as he was brilliant, Sutter persuaded Governor Alvarado to grant him 48,400 acres of land for the sake of curtailing American encroachment on the Mexican territory of California. And this stretch of land was to be called New Helvetia, which is also stands for New Switzerland. And Sutter was given a right to represent the establishment of New Helvetia, all the laws of the country, to function as a political authority and dispenser of justice in order to prevent the robberies committed by adventurers from the United States and to stop the invasion of savage Indians and the hunting and trading by companies from the Columbia River. The governor stipulated, however, that for Sutter to qualify for land ownership, he had to reside in the territory for a year and become a Mexican citizen, which he did to assuage the governor on August 29, 1840. However, shortly after his land tract was granted and his fort erected, Sutter quickly reneged on his agreement to discourage European trespass. So he sort of, like, Sutter, this is the thing, I mean, you have to say it's impressive to be able to get like 48,000 acres of land. He had this idea of creating a utopia, sort of an agricultural utopia, because he saw the land for what it was. It was rich land, especially in that Sacramento Valley along the Sacramento River. It was mainly, besides the Native Americans that were there, there was nobody there. And he felt like it was a new, pristine land that he could, mold it to what he wanted to. So he presented this, and this is very attractive to, not only is it going to be keeping the European settlement encroaching upon their new territory, but it would also sort of build that land up and be very profitable for Mexico, because they really weren't doing anything with it at that stage. They just didn't understand who they were dealing with necessarily. And his plan all along was to bring European settlement into there, not necessarily the Russians, but the British, the American citizens, German immigrants, Swiss immigrants, and all of them. And he really did see this as this could be a utopia. The problem is, whenever you hear the term utopia, it raises red flags, because usually there's nefarious purposes or ways of getting to that utopia, which we'll get into in the next video and talk a little more deeply of how he actually accomplished creating this utopia, because he did. He actually accomplished it, and he gets a lot of credit for creating all the agriculture in the area, the orchards, all that type of stuff, cultivating the land. He was very smart with that. He also did pave a path for the European settlers to come in, and he did uphold law and those types of things. So he did do quite a bit of the things that he was supposed to. He just accomplished a lot of those riches. He accomplished via horrible, horrible ways and devastation to the native peoples of the area, which we'll go into. And of course, eventually they discovered gold there at Sutter's Mill. And eventually, the only port that was there at the time was San Francisco. I think I had said in the vlog, I had said San Francisco instead of Sacramento. I was thinking about everybody came in through San Francisco, so thanks for pointing that out, Jay. My brain farted for a second there. But it is everything that California became, a lot of that can be attributed to John Augustus Sutter, but a lot of everything it became, where it became basically anarchy and just everybody going in and just taking whatever they want, was also his fault. because of the way he sort of set things up. So, and him ultimately losing everything, if you will, which even that I sort of imagined from the stories that he was penniless, but which he wasn't. He was still quite well off. He was just trying to get his money back for all the livestock he lost, all the land he lost, because technically as well, when the revolution happened in Texas and we won that war against Mexico, California and those other territories sort of came along with Texas. His agreement was with the Mexican government, not with the U.S. government. So I think that played a role into why he didn't keep anything. And also, I think they had heard about a lot of the things that he had done to accomplish what he had accomplished. So I don't think there was a whole lot of love lost necessarily in that regard. And I think it was everybody for themselves. It was sort of, he was a product of his own system, and he ultimately wound out losing everything to people that were just as greedy, if not greedier than him. And that's just sort of, when you run a wild, wild west type scenario like that, that's what happens. So in the next video, we're going to go into John Sutter's life more, mainly at the Sutter's Mill, Sutter's Fort, because we talked about some of his other, keep in mind the behavioral characteristics that he had. He had a real knack for using people, abusing people, sort of putting himself first. If it, he would take care of his family to a degree, but if it came down to him or his family, it was him. That's just who he was as a person. He was a very selfish individual, very self-centered, and he really, really abused a lot of people. So mainly the native peoples, and we'll go into depth with that. We'll also go into some of the individuals that described the conditions in which these individuals were living in, and the abuses that he did, and why there was the controversies with him, why his statues were torn down, why something as simple as the General Sutter Inn in Lidditz was renamed back to more what it was originally, because of the controversies that came up. Because like myself, until I really researched into him, I didn't know who he actually was as a person. And like I said, it's not, as you go through his life and you see the things that he did and how he just sort of didn't follow his word with a lot of things, and his tendencies to take an easy route to make money, and to abuse people, to not view people as human, that type of stuff. There were warning signs earlier in his life how he behaved himself. And, people are creatures of habit, and he certainly was that. So with that, I'll say thank you for coming along and taking part in this video. And as always, we'll see you all about town, and we'll see you tomorrow with the second part of this video.